entirely God's providence that I got asked to do this role. I heard about the plans, and I thought there'd be no way that anybody would think of me. I'd be too young, I'd be too peripheral, I'd be too kind of radical for some of the older churches. Part of the plan was they wanted to appoint a new training director, and I knew that I'd be asked if I'd consider that. But in my ministry, I've always been a generalist rather than just focused on one thing. So I was asked to become training director, and I explained why I didn't want to do that and why my vision was broader than that. And the result was that I was then asked to become the national director. So it was a total surprise to me. I hadn't been planning it, but they recognised something of a leadership potential there. And in the end, the churches voted for me to be appointed as the national leader. I'd already got leadership in my local church. I'd got some national leadership through the other initiatives I'd started. I would never have expected to be asked to become the leader. And in some sense, they took a risk with somebody who was younger, somebody who was slightly more edgy. But I think they recognised that that is what they needed. There were a generation of leaders who were in their 50s, who were a generation older than me. And I thought they would pick one of those guys. I was 40 when I was appointed. And effectively what they did was they jumped a whole generation. The old structure was largely led by men who were in their 60s. There was a generation of 50-year-olds who could have been asked to lead. But instead, they jumped a whole generation. And what that has done is it's enabled us to be a more youthful movement. It's connected us with the younger generation. So I was appointed national director. There was a bit of a process to get there. But in that role, I've then been able to build a ministry team around me. So I've appointed full-time men to serve as my pastoral director, leading care for churches, my training director, raising up pastors for the next generation, my mission director leading us in church planting and in evangelism. I've got a practical services director who oversees the legal services that we provide for our churches. So I was able to bring together a team. And what's really interesting is that the people I recruited for that team were the group of 50-year-old pastors. So they may not have become the overall national leader, but I saw that they were the gifted people who could take it forwards. I think when they appointed me, they thought that I'd want to recruit a group of 30-year-olds. But actually, I recruited the 50-year-olds and told them, I want you to come and help make this vision work. And that has been a brilliant sort of strategic kind of move, and they've done a wonderful job. The lesson there is don't write off the older generation. They can be absolutely crucial to leading change if they're with you. And so I benefited hugely from recruiting that ministry team. So that's the leadership I put in place to enable us to advance our ministries. And what's been really important in the change is making quick progress in demonstrating the benefits of change. So everybody is skeptical of change when it's first introduced. And when we first did the change, there were all those who said it'll never work. You won't be able to do it. But the crucial thing is to show rapid gospel gains, rapid successes that show that it makes a difference. So we've tried to do two things. We've tried to think about what are the things that we can do over the very long term that will make a difference. What are our big long-term changes? But then what are the very quick things we can do that make an obvious difference? If you do some things that make an obvious difference quickly, that very easily helps everybody to understand that the change is a good thing. If you take a footballing analogy, it's rather like scoring a couple of goals in the first 10 minutes. If you score a couple of goals in the first 10 minutes, your supporters are all on your side. And so we did that. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. We've tried to connect with our culture and history. So I've done quite a lot of work of researching the history of the organisation and have tried to say that what we have become is the fulfilment of our original vision. I think a generation had forgotten what our original vision was. They thought that our vision was to stand firm for conservative culture. I went back to the history and said that wasn't what our founding fathers wanted. They wanted to work together to advance the gospel. So I've tried to reconnect with our history and show that this is not a radical change, this is actually the fulfilment of our original purpose. And quite a lot of people have been surprised to discover what our original purpose was. But I've gone back and read all of the history to be able to do that. The most important thing has been changing the institutional culture. And that's largely by having drawn in the churches that were already more contemporary and making them the centre. So deliberately choosing to give those churches profile, to give their leaders profile in our conferences and our events. What I've done is basically said it's already there, it's already changed. And then invite those people to come and be at the centre of the movement. Sorry? What do I mean by give them profile? Make sure that they're seen to be the leaders of the movement. So if we have a conference, inviting them to be the speakers, inviting them to give the seminars. In our magazine, making sure that it's their churches that are also featured as models of thriving ministry. So it's moving them from the periphery to the very centre of what's happening. So what you want to do is make the movement as a whole aware of the most thriving elements of the movement. There's nothing that actually encourages people more than hearing success and hearing good models. Our problem is we weren't hearing those, and I moved them to the centre. That has shifted the centre of gravity of the movement. The centre of gravity of the movement was the small, more conservative churches. The centre of gravity of the movement is now the conservative theologically but culturally contemporary churches. So to put it in terms, it's the difference between the churches that would use an organ and a piano and the churches that would use a guitar band for their music. That make sense? And it's that group of churches that have now become defining of the culture. And we basically lost the fear. Some of the smaller churches used to say, you know, you can't sing modern songs, you can't use a guitar. If you do that, we don't like it. You're offenders. And for a long period of time, the organisation had indulged that and had said, okay, if it offends you, we won't do it. But what we decided is we can't carry on like that. You have to do what you believe is right for the future. And if some people get offended, in the end, that's their problem. They can't hold the culture to ransom just because they don't like it. So shifting the centre of gravity brings about the cultural change, and you, of course, winning new churches to join, new leaders to come and be on board. Another key thing, winning over the younger generation to the vision. The future of the movement is its young leaders. The future of any movement is its young leaders. The absolute key people to have on board and invest in are your under 35 leaders. And we devoted a lot of our energy to cultivating and drawing in the younger leaders to be involved, to understand our vision. We held conferences for them in which we would share our heart and our purpose so that they would be won over to what we were trying to do, so they would understand it. And inevitably in change, there were some churches and some older leaders who were sceptical. And I spent a lot of time investing in them, visiting, talking to the pastors, trying to understand their objections, to win them. Now, some of those churches would never be won. Others, I knew it would take some years for them to be won, but I wanted them to be won. So I prioritised my time on the younger leaders and on the churches that needed winning over. The mass of churches that probably might not like it very much, but probably wouldn't leave and wouldn't create too much of a problem, I didn't give my time to them, because they would just about stick with us. When you make changes, there will always be some people who will stick with you. They may not like it, but they will stick with you. At one level, you can, to some degree, take them for granted. Not totally, but they're not where your energy needs to go. Your energy needs to go in drawing in the young leaders who will be the future, and in winning over the sceptical people who might make change difficult. So that's what we did. As I said, we wanted to achieve specific goals that would advance the gospel. If we could show we were making progress in training and planting and other areas, there is nothing like moving forward to encourage people to be part of change. So some of that initial skepticism was overcome by some successes. And the other key thing we did was to totally change our communication strategy. We had not made much use of the web or of social media. We had communicated largely through a magazine. We had a very poor website. And of course, that is not the way that the younger generation communicates. So we very deliberately chose to go for a different communication platform and to make the web, blogs, social media, Twitter, much more central to how we communicated our message, because that would connect with the key people that we needed to win over. It would also give us a much more effective public profile with other groups who might have misunderstood us or thought that we weren't doing very much. It meant that we were out there in the public sphere, so interested people could look in. So we spent a considerable amount of time and resource changing our communications. Well, that gives you just an overall flavour of what's happened. Is there anything anybody wants to ask sort of at this point about what we've done? Is there anything that struck you or anything you want to ask a bit more about? Okay. Okay, who's appointing local pastors is the question. The churches are all independent, so the local churches appoint their own pastors. So that's a decision for the local church.
So the only thing you could do was choose the ones who wanted.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we had no power over that. We are an association of churches that make collective decisions. The trust board, the 12 men, are elected by all of the churches. So they're the representatives of the churches, and I'm appointed by that trust board. So there is an ultimate accountability to the churches. We have an annual assembly at which collective decisions can be made. So the churches could remove the trust board, the churches could remove me. So they've got almost a veto that they could apply. But in individual local churches, I have no power. The only power I have is the power of persuasion and friendship. I can't make anybody do anything, which actually I value. I believe that's biblical. Personally, I think that protects me. It means I can't become a dictator. And I really appreciate that when I go into a situation, I cannot say, this is what you've got to do. I have to say, here are some ideas. This is what I'd love to see. What would you like to do? So I find that helpful. That's a good question. How big does an organisation have to be in order for there to be an executive director? I don't think there's any answer that applies in every situation. The answer is, does having an executive director enable the organisation to accomplish its goals most effectively? I do think that in a culture in which volunteerism is not possible in the same way, more and more we will need full-time staff to lead ministries. But the real question is, does the ministry and what it's achieving and what it could achieve, will that best be served by having a full-time executive director? Most gospel initiatives start out with a pastor or a leader giving some of their time to it. But the growth of that initiative means that inevitably they have to become full-time, or it requires somebody else to come in and join it. So I would say in starting organisations, you don't want to start by saying, here's our big staff team that we've got to have for the beginning. I think you want people who've got initiative and drive to start things up, to do them alongside their other ministries, but for it to grow to such a point where it becomes inevitable that they have to lead it. That actually happened in my church in Birmingham. I planted the church while I was working full-time teaching law in the university. I was deputy head of the law faculty of a school of about 1,000 people. The church grew from 25 up to maybe 250. And by that stage, I just couldn't do my job and lead the church anymore. So I then went part-time at work. It then grew a bit more. And eventually I went full-time working for the church. But having a full-time appointment was on the basis of growth. So I would say that you want to see growth and the need for an executive director on the basis that this is a growing ministry that needs it. We had a very interesting situation. There were 3 of us who planted the church together, and we worked as co-pastors. And over the course of 11 years, we all became full-time. I was the chair of the group of pastors, but it wasn't quite an authoritative senior pastor and others. We were equal pastors, each of whom contributed to the ministry as a whole. And just over time, all 3 of us became co-leaders. Now that's unusual because it was a planting situation. When I left to work for the FIEC, one of my fellow co-pastors has in effect become the senior pastor and now has an assistant pastor working for him. But the circumstances in which we planted as a team meant that we had a model of team ministry. Does that help? But it was actually it was going to be a question as to how would that leadership evolve, because it wouldn't last forever. And in God's goodness, I had a different ministry that I was called to move on to, and then the leadership structure changed. And I think that the lesson from that is leadership structures have to be constantly developing. You need leadership structures that do the job, and they need to be shaped around the circumstances and shaped around the people. So I think leadership and leadership models have to be determined by what will best advance the gospel. You don't always start by saying, here's the leadership we want, let's find somebody to do it. Often you say, here's the leader we need, let's make a structure work that enables them to do their job. Let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we've managed to do then. Just some of the early successes. Over the course of the last 4 years, as a result of this change, there has been a massive cultural difference, a clear gospel vision. Our objective as the FIEC is we want to work together to evangelise Britain and beyond. That's our objective. We are committed to local churches. We believe that the way that people are reached is by thriving local churches in every community. So what we're all about is about establishing, serving, supporting local churches. But the bit that we do is we want to encourage those churches to work together for the bigger picture. So that's our overall objective. So we've got a clarity of what we're trying to do. And because we've now become a gospel vision, rather than simply defending cultural Christianity, we have new churches joining us. So the last 3 years, we've had about 60 churches join the FIEC. Some of those are new church plants. Some of those are historic independent churches that have now wanted to join the vision. So our largest church is now a big Baptist church in Edinburgh, a church called Charlotte Chapel, that joined us just over a year ago. They have a membership of 800. Up until now, they've always been an independent church, but they joined the FIEC because they wanted to help make that gospel vision a reality. And that's been really exciting to me, is seeing new churches join. We have seen some churches leave. There are some that have not liked the changes. There are others that are small and have closed, but it's been a very small number that have left. And those have usually been the churches that are ultra-conservative. And they've felt that they want to belong to groups that are more narrow than we are. But in the main, it's been new churches joining. Over the course of that 4 years, we've more than doubled our budget from the churches. The way we're funded is by the churches making donations to us. We ask the churches to make a voluntary donation. It's not a fee or a subscription, but we ask them for a suggested sum that's based on their size. So larger churches give more. And we've had to double the amount we've asked from our churches to enable them to fund the new staff. And the history has been that in the FIEC, churches never want to give more money. The older generation would say you can never ask for more money, the churches won't give it. We doubled the contributions from our churches over 3 years. And actually what that shows is that the churches are on board with the vision. So we grew our budget from about £250,000 to now more like £500,000. And we're likely to grow that budget over the next few years. Not only have we received money from our churches, that the money from our churches covers our operational costs. We've gone out to raise money for funding our ministries from external donors. And over the last 3 years, we've raised about £750,000 to invest in ministries. And what we've mainly done with that is used it to fund men in training for ministry and church plants. So one of the key things we've started doing is raising significant sums of money to invest in training future leaders. We don't own a theological college or a seminary, but we do send people to a number of seminaries. And at the moment, because we've raised this money for the first time, we're helping pay people to go to Theological College. The main college that we would send to is Oak Hill. Most of our students would be there. West, LTS, but also some American colleges. So some guys go to RTS, others would go to TEDS. Gordon Conwell would be another college that people go to. Some would go to Moore College in Australia. But we're able to fund, and at the moment we're supporting about 20 students a year to go to Bible college. And we've also used some of that money to help our medium-sized churches to employ assistant pastors. What we wanted to do is create training jobs in churches so that when you leave college, you can come and work with a senior pastor for 3 years before becoming a pastor yourself. And we've never done that before as a movement. And it's just been hugely significant. One of the most encouraging things is that God seems to be raising up a generation of younger leaders. We've started a conference for people thinking of full-time gospel ministry. We've now run that for 2 years, and we have about 160 people coming to it, all 30 or under, which for us is just really encouraging. And for a movement that 5 years ago looked as though all of its leaders were old and they were going to die and not be replaced, suddenly we have a group of young leaders who are saying, I want to be part of this movement. We've engaged with wider evangelicalism in Britain. FIEC was perceived as historically separatist. So we were not particularly good at connecting with others. But we have wanted to partner and develop good relationships with all other gospel people. So whether amongst the Anglicans, whether amongst kind of the Pentecostals and charismatics, I've worked very hard to build wider relationships so that we're part of the bigger picture. I want other groups to know that we want to be friends with those who share our core gospel convictions. It's not about us. It's actually about the gospel in the nation. And we've got to work together if we're going to reach the country. In the UK, maybe 3 to 5% of people are born-again evangelical believers. That may be many more than your country, but it's still a tiny number. So we very deliberately try to create friendly relationships with those who share our core gospel beliefs. So we've tried to develop cooperative relationships with other movements and networks. Thank you. So other leaders and groups. Some of you may know, for example, Acts 29. Acts 29, the leader of Acts 29 worldwide, a guy called Steve Timmis, is actually from an FIEC church. And we work well with him, we work well with their local churches. Most of the churches in England that are Acts 29 are also in some way, or at least half of them, are involved in FIEC. So that's just an example of the kind of partnerships that we've wanted to develop. And it's fine. Our churches can belong to multiple connections if that serves the gospel. Our leaders' conference has grown from about 250 to now about 500. And leaders are making that a key point of their year. And as I said, for the first time, we as a movement have developed a much stronger commitment to theological training for pastors. I think the secular challenge of Western Europe means that our leaders need to be even better educated than they have been. The danger is of thinking they need less training. But to meet the challenges of today, they need to be more thoroughly rooted in historic evangelical theology. And they also need to understand contemporary culture and the situation in which they find themselves. So we've rediscovered a commitment to training. As I look to the future, this is really just a beginning. We've made progress, but it's only the beginning. We've just begun to scratch the surface. We face a massive task of reaching a largely lost nation. So we are seeking to do that. Areas that we've not made much progress on yet are revitalising small and struggling churches. We need to be able to do that. And we're just beginning to develop some international connections with other groups like FIEC around the world. I think there's a real place for similar groups around the world to work together for the bigger kind of gospel picture. So there's huge amounts to be done. But I'm pleased with the progress that's been made, and there is just a different feel. If I can summarise it like this, I got an email from one of our church leaders recently that said, I've always been part of the FIEC, but in the past I used to be really embarrassed I was part of the FIEC. It's not something I would talk about. It wasn't an identity I would use. But his email says, but because of the changes over the last 4 years, I am now delighted and proud to be part of the FIEC. And I think that summarises the change. From a commitment but embarrassment to an enthusiasm, because they can see that it's gospel-hearted and there's a growing future. And really that's, I think, the change that we've managed to bring around. So what are the key lessons? Let me just quickly do those, and then you can ask me what you want. Sometimes it is right to renew existing movements. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel. Existing movements often have infrastructure, they have a support base, they may have buildings, they've got a history, they have a public profile. There's much to use. If you start something new, you have to create the infrastructure from scratch. Whereas if you're able to change something that exists, you can make use of that infrastructure and make sure that it's used for the gospel. As I said at the beginning, it needs to be both and. But it isn't always necessary to start from scratch. Clarity of vision and purpose is essential. You will only bring about real change if you have clarity of vision and purpose. What's it for? What is this movement trying to achieve? If you have no sense of where you're trying to go, nobody is going to join you in going there. So absolutely essential to refreshing movements is clarity of vision and purpose. And usually they need refreshing because that's what's been lost. Leadership is absolutely key. change will only be brought about by leaders who can bring about change. There are some leaders who can lead existing organisations that are going well and that are well established. But if you're going to revitalise somebody, you've got to be a leader who is capable of bringing about change. That's going to require real skills of analysis, persuasion, motivation, judgment. So you need a leader who is able to do that. Not everybody can, and not everybody should. Learn from others. Just copy the best models of what there is around. All of us, in the end, are plagiarists. Aren't you? All of our sermons are plagiarism. Do you ever really give a sermon in which what you say in it isn't actually gleaned from the commentaries or from other sermons? When did you actually include an original thought? I hardly ever do. Often I've included thoughts that I sort of read about 10 years ago and I've completely forgotten where I ever got them from. But we're all basically plagiarists. Or to put that a better way, we're all good at learning from the wisdom and the experience of others. Make best use of the good models. Just copy what others are doing and do it well. So look at other movements. Look at how they're working. They may be in different theological strands. But learn the lessons of what works. What works organisationally? What works in terms of communication? What works in terms of governance structure? Don't be embarrassed to copy others if it works. Of course, obviously, your idea of what works is going to be shaped by Scripture. There are limits, there's a boundary. But within that, learn from best practice. Invest for the long term, not the short term. I know that you need short-term delivery. You do need to achieve some short-term results. But revitalisation is a long-term project. I see the FIEC and changing the FIEC as being a 20-year job. And I want to set out on it expecting that that will be the case. It may be the Lord moves me on. If that's what he does, that's fine. But I think I needed to approach this job thinking this will be the only thing I will do for the rest of my ministry. Because this is not going to change overnight. There's massive potential to be a thriving gospel movement for the nation, but it's going to require years of investment. So don't embark on revitalizations thinking I can give 3 years to this and then move on. Almost invariably, it will require a long-term investment to make the change possible and to really embed that change. Accept that some will leave and complain. You know this from ministry anyway, but you've just got to have a thick skin. Or at least if you've got a thin skin, you've got to have some good friends you can go and cry with. You will get opposition. The key question is where you do get opposition, you've got to judge, do I need to take account of this or can I ignore it? Is it really important to listen, or is this something that I just really have to ignore and press on? That's a judgment question. But you will need a thick skin, and you will get a package of emails and letters that complain about what you're doing. Quite a large number of them just need to be deleted and chucked in the bin. But you need to listen to the ones that are really important. But just be prepared for that. Not everybody will love you and what you're doing. You can never expect that, but anybody who's been in ministry for any time should know that anyway. And as I said, lastly, achieve some demonstrable benefits. So bear in mind the long-term goals and the short-term steps. You may not even tell the movement what the long-term goals are. That may be too big a vision for them to bear. You may only want them to be able to see 3 or 4 steps ahead. You may have a really big vision. But in order for them to change, they need to have an intermediate vision. And then you show them you can lead them to that. But you have to do things that establish your credibility and that make the change seem significant and worthwhile. So some short-term achievements. And in your strategic planning, you need to make sure you're building in what are those deliverable achievements at an early stage. Where can I make an immediate difference? That may not be your long-term priority, but it is your priority to bring about change. Bringing about change requires quick results in some things. So it's rather like low-hanging fruit on trees. Pick some low-hanging fruit, even if the best fruit is the top and you can't get it for another 10 years. Don't simply go for the top and leave the sort of low-hanging fruit to rot. What the movement supporters will want to see is that you are gathering some fruit. And that's the importance of the sort of deliverable achievements.